Hi, and welcome back to our APES Flipped Classroom, where we're continuing our conversation about aquatic and terrestrial pollutants, pretty much wrapping up our aquatic pollutants today with persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. So we're going to talk about what a persistent organic pollutant is and why they are such a hazard for our ecosystems and our organisms. So first, what they are. So POPs stands for persistent organic pollutants. So the word persistent means that they are long lasting. They don't break down easily in the environment. This means that instead they accumulate in the soil, they build up in water. And so because they don't break down, their concentration over time increases as long as it is being manufactured or added. And even if the manufacture or the leak is stopped, then the concentrations stay high for a long time because they don't break down easily. And organic, of course, means that it's carbon-based. But they are synthetic. These are not naturally produced organic compounds. They are synthetic compounds. One of the dangers of these persistent organic pollutants is that most of them, being large carbon-based molecules, are non-polar, which means that they are fat soluble, which means they're going to dissolve into the fat. That means they're going to be stored in the fat. Things that humans and other organisms take in that are water soluble, if we have an excess of them, they're just eliminated through the waste stream. But fat soluble compounds that are taken into the body, they dissolve into the fat. It means they're not processed and released through the urine system. This also means that over time, they can be slowly released from that fatty tissue into the bloodstream. And that's going to have long-term effects on our brain and other organs. Very often, these persistent organic pollutants have a significant impact on the endocrine system or the reproductive system. The fact that they are soluble in fats does give us some protection from them initially. If there's an acute exposure, it can dissolve in fat rather than immediately damaging something like the liver, but then we have that long-term release. Okay, so some examples of persistent organic pollutants and some of their sources. So DDT is one of the most common examples of a persistent organic pollutant, along with PCBs, PBDEs, BPA, dioxins, phthalates, and perchlorates, and we'll address several of these. So DDT was an insecticide that was widely used. It was phased out in most developed nations in about the 1980s. Because it was discovered that it is a toxin for a lot of predatory birds. It actually causes their shells to not be solid enough. And so when the mother bird incubates the eggs, she actually crushes them. And it nearly wiped out the American bald eagle population before DDT was eliminated. Unfortunately, although it's no longer being used as an insecticide in developed nations, it does, because it's a persistent organic pollutant, persist in soils and sediments in a lot of aquatic ecosystems, which means that it can still build up in food webs. PCBs are a plastic additive. It increases flexibility in plastics. It was used a lot in sealants and in wire coatings, so that it entered the environment from wastewater from factories that were producing PCB and PBDE containing plastics, and so again, because it persists, it still stays there in the water. BPA, a lot of the time today, you'll see bottles that say that they're BPA free, or even cans that say that they're BPA free. BPA is another plastic additive. And it turns out that that's also an endocrine disruptor. It is persistent, so it stays in our water system. Another common source of those persistent organic pollutants is medications. So drugs, pharmaceutical compounds. This can be things like steroids or reproductive hormones or antibiotics that, because they pass through us and into our sewage, are then released from treatment plants. They can then persist in streams and rivers and disrupt those aquatic organisms' endocrine functions. Moving on to dioxins. So dioxins used to be a major problem, a side effect of bleaching. And so they were a big problem with the paper industry until it was discovered that that was a problem. And so that's now been cleaned up. These days, the most significant contributor of dioxins is fertilizer production, burning of medical waste, a certain amount with fossil fuels, and biomass. So combustion can create dioxins. Dioxins, again, can enter our water stream and our soil. Our exposure generally comes from animal fats, meat, dairy, and fish, because the dioxins build up in that animal fat tissue. When we consume it, then we also consume the dioxins. Okay, so PCBs, these are additives in paints and plastics. They get released into the aquatic ecosystems by industrial wastewater. They can be toxic to fish. They cause spawning failure, endocrine disruption. The amount of PCB in orcas or killer whales in their fatty tissue is incredibly high because they're at the top of the food chain. And so scientists speculate that that's one of the reasons that populations and reproduction among killer whales or orcas is significantly down. PCBs also cause reproductive failure in humans, as well as being implicated as carcinogens. Again, our exposure comes from consuming animals. Same thing with PBDEs and with phthalates. So again, those are things that we're exposed to because we consume animals that have consumed them. Although phthalates, we have some exposure directly. If we are using a phthalate containing plastic, then that can actually leach out into our food. And BPA is a specific phthalate. Okay, perchlorates, last one, I think. Yes. So these are given off by rockets, by missiles, even by fireworks. Perchlorate contamination is particularly common near military testing sites or rocket launch pads. And like all other POPs, they can remain in the soil, can leach into the groundwater, can run off into surface waters. Again, can be consumed by organisms low on the food chain and eventually find their way up to us. Another issue with persistent organic pollutants is that because they are relatively small molecules and they're organic, they can frequently be volatile, which means that they can enter the atmosphere easily and travel long distances through wind. They can also enter waterways, and again, can travel long distances. So persistent organic pollutants can contaminate areas that are far away from the original source of the persistent organic pollutant. They enter the soil and water, they're eaten by animals, stored in their fat, and consumed by us as humans. We also sometimes consume persistent organic pollutants in our drinking water. So your practice FRQ for today is to explain why the release of PCBs into an aquatic ecosystem may have a longer lasting negative impact on organisms than the release of synthetic nitrates. So why would PCBs be a more significant concern than fertilizer? All right, as always, I look forward to hearing your questions, and I'll see you in class.